Hannibal sent a messenger to Rome. He offered to return the prisoners. For a price. The Senate said no. 216 BC. Rome. The city that lost 50,000 men in one morning decides what it is. This is Roman Knights. We go back. We listen. We stay a while. 3 days after Cannae. The city is still standing. Hannibal did not expect that either. Chapter 1. The day Varro came home, the news arrived in pieces. It always does. A battle of this size cannot be carried by a single message. The information is too large. A single message can carry a number. It cannot carry the shape of the thing the number came from. The shape arrives later, in fragments, carried by different people who were in different positions and saw different parts of it. The first rider brought a number, 47,000. He said it twice because the people who heard it the first time asked him to repeat it. He said it again. The number was the same both times. He had been riding since the night before. He had been riding without stopping except to change horses. He said the number and then he said he needed water. The second rider brought names. He had a list, partial, written in the dark in a camp at Canusium, by a man trying to write down what he remembered before he forgot. Officers and tribunes and men of senatorial rank whose deaths he had personally witnessed. The list was written in a hand that was not steady. The man had been writing in the dark after a long and violent day. The third rider brought the information that the city had been dreading most. Both consuls. The third rider said, "Both consuls are down." Then a correction arrived. One consul has survived. The man delivering the correction had to explain himself at the gate. The information changed the number of dead consuls. That required confirmation. He confirmed it. One consul has survived. The city heard all of this over the course of a day. By nightfall, Rome knew what had happened on the plain below Cannae. The city received the news differently in different places. In the forum, men gathered around the riders as they came in. They spoke in groups. The groups grew. The information moved outward from the center the way information always moves in a city. By the time it reached the outer districts, it had been carried by 100 mouths, changed in the carrying. The way information changes when it moves through many people in quick succession. The number shifted. 47,000, 60,000, 40,000, 80,000. The exact number was not the point. The scale was clear. Rome had lost. Not in the ordinary way. Not a defeat that a reorganized army could address next season. Not a setback that the legions could correct with better positioning and a different general. Something that required a different word. Something that the Forum had not quite had the word for since Trasimene, and before that had not needed. Catastrophe. The word moved through the city with the riders and the groups and the mouths. In the wealthier houses on the Palatine, the news was received indoors. Controlled. Shaped by the requirements of their position. The grief was present. The appropriate expressions were present. The appropriate waiting before doing anything public was present. They had learned to receive bad news the way that people learn to do anything important. With practice. Over generations. In the Subura there was no waiting. The Subura is where the soldiers came from. Not the officers. Not the tribunes, the men who had stood in the compressed formation, who had pressed forward while the Gauls gave ground and it looked like winning, who had pressed forward into the space that was closing around them. Their families lived in the Subura. The women of the Subura knew before the official announcement. They knew, the way women know when the men have not come back in the time they should. When the riders come through with specific expressions. When the children on the street stop running and stand in the doorways watching the riders. They came out before anyone gave them permission. They came out into the streets the way people come out when they need to be together. When being alone with the news is worse than being in the street. They stood in the streets of the Subura in the evening. They made the sounds that cities have always made. When a large number of their men do not come back. The noise was very loud. It carried. Even on the Palatine, where the appropriate waiting was happening in the appropriate rooms, the noise from the Subura carried. It was a specific noise, distinguishable from other kinds of city noise. The people on the Palatine who heard it knew what it was. Some of them had heard it before, from previous battles, from previous losses. They recognized the sound. The noise from the Subura and the controlled silence on the Palatine were both grief. They were not the same grief. They were grief shaped by different circumstances. Both were real. The city held both of them at once. And underneath the noise, the city continued. The bread was still being sold at the correct hours. The fuller's shop was still doing its work. The Tiber was doing what the Tiber always did. The moneylenders on the Via Sacra were still at their tables. The city was in grief, and the city was also completely operational. Both of these things were simultaneously true. This was the first sign of what the city was. Not the monuments, not the walls, not the names of the consuls or the number of legions or the treaties with the allied cities. The first sign was this, that a city could hold grief and operations together in the same hour, could be at the tables and in the streets at the same time. Rome had done this before. It would do it again. The Senate met the same evening. They ordered a period of mourning, 30 days, public and official. Shops closed at midday. No public ceremonies. No celebrations or festivals for the duration. The temples would receive whoever came at whatever hour. Then the Senate went back to work. There was a list of things to decide. The list was long. They began at the top. Varro came home 4 days after the battle. He had been at Venusia. He had not spent those 4 days resting. He had spent them doing the things a surviving consul does. Assessing what survived. Organizing the remnants into something with shape. Sending riders in multiple directions. Writing the letters that needed to be written and sending them through channels that were still functioning. He had written to Rome. He had written the message carefully. He had thought about it for a long time before writing. He had thought about what Rome needed to know and in what order. The message said, "The battle is lost. The consul has survived." These were the two most important pieces of information. He put them in that order. He had sent the message. Then he had done the other things. Then on the 4th day he rode north. The road from Venusia to Rome. He had ridden this road in the other direction 5 months ago. Moving south with the army. The road had felt different then. The army around him. The noise of a large force in motion. The dust of many men and animals. The particular energy of a force that had a destination and the resources to reach it. He was riding north now with a small escort. The road felt different. He recognized sections of it. The ridge above the pass where the column had stopped to adjust loads. The farmhouse where the owner had been standing at his gate watching the army go by. The old man had not waved. He had just watched. The expression of a man who had seen armies before, who had a specific opinion about what they meant for the farm. He passed the farmhouse again going north. No one was at the gate. He rode through the sections of road he recognized and through the sections he did not. The landscape of Apulia giving way to Samnium, giving way to Latium. The hills getting more familiar. The road getting more used. The signs of a city ahead. He thought about the road in both directions. He had ridden this road south 5 months ago with an army. An army on the road has a specific character. It is not one thing. It is many things moving together. the cavalry at different intervals from the infantry, the supply lines at different intervals from the cavalry, the command groups moving at a pace that kept them with the whole, the engineers checking the bridges, the quartermasters managing the intervals, a consul overseeing all of it. He had overseen all of it. He was not overseeing anything now. He was a man on a road with a small escort, riding north, carrying a number and a list of names, the memory of a plane below Cannae in August. He had tried, in the 4 days at Venusia, to think about what had happened, to understand it in the way that a military man tries to understand what went wrong. He had done this after other bad days in his career. He had looked at the engagement and assessed it and tried to understand what could have been done differently. He had tried this at Venusia. He had found that the question was not simple. The formation had been his formation. He had compressed the infantry tighter than the existing practice. He had wanted mass. He had believed in the mass. He had believed the mass would break through any center Hannibal could put in front of it. 86,000 Romans. The full weight of Rome pressing forward. He had not been wrong about the mass. The mass had broken through the center. The center had given ground because the center was designed to give ground. He had not been wrong about the mass. He had been wrong about what the center was designed to do. He had assessed the center as a thing to be broken. He had not assessed it as a mechanism for moving the mass into a position with walls on 3 sides that did not look like walls until the 4th wall closed. This was not a failure of courage. This was not a failure of command. He was not certain what word to use for it. He had used Hannibal's strength against himself. He had given Hannibal 86,000 men pressing forward. Hannibal had used that press to complete a geometry. Hannibal had designed it. Paulus had identified it. Varro had heard about it and had not fully understood. He had not fully understood it. He thought about this on the road. He was tired in the specific way of a man who has been making decisions continuously for 4 days. Not the tired that sleep fixes, a deeper tired. The tired that requires time and distance and something other than more decisions. He did not have access to time or distance or something other than more decisions. He rode. He arrived at the Capena Gate in the morning. The Capena Gate faced south. It faced in the direction of Apulia. He arrived at this gate on a tired horse with a small escort. He had the exhaustion of a man who has not slept properly, since a thing happened that he cannot stop seeing. He stopped at the gate. A delegation was waiting for him, not a small one. He saw it from a distance and did not understand it at first. A group of men at the gate, senior men he recognized from 50 paces. He recognized them by their posture and their robes and the way they stood. He had been in the same rooms with these men for 20 years. He stopped his horse. He looked at them. The Senate had come out. Senior men with decades of service and the full authority of what they represented. They had left the city. They had walked to the gate. They were standing outside the walls waiting for him. This did not happen. The Senate had come to him instead. He dismounted. His legs were not entirely cooperative. He had been on a horse for too many days. He stood on the road outside the Capena Gate and he looked at the delegation in front of him. He counted them, the habit of a military man, before he could stop himself. 12 senators, the most senior ones, men he had argued with and agreed with and been outvoted by and outmaneuvered. They had come out of the city to meet him at the gate. One of the senior senators stepped forward. An older man, white-haired, the kind of senator who had been in every important session for 30 years, who remembered the details of all of them. He had the voice that comes from a lifetime of speaking in large rooms. He said the words the Senate had authorized. He said, On behalf of the Senate and people of Rome, we are grateful. You did not despair of the Republic. Varro stood at the Capena gate. He had prepared for many things on the road from Venusia. He had prepared carefully because preparation was what he did. He had run through the possibilities on the road. A formal censure. The particular silence that surrounds a man who everyone holds responsible for something. Cold faces. Cold words. The way the Senate could express disapproval without using words that gave you anything to respond to. He had prepared for this. He had not prepared for 12 senators outside the gate. He nodded. He said what was appropriate. He said it in the voice of a man whose situation does not match any preparation. When the appropriate voice is the only reliable tool. He went inside. The city closed around him. He had expected a ruined city, or a panicked one. He had expected streets full of the immediate aftermath of catastrophe. He had been inside catastrophes before. He knew what they looked like. They looked like a city that has stopped being itself, that has given up the ordinary operations and given itself over to the emergency. The city was in mourning. It was also completely itself. The markets were open at the correct hours. The bread was being sold. Iron on stone in the streets the way it always was. The Tiber was doing what the Tiber did. The children of the Subura were running in the alley behind the fuller's shop. Running the way children run when they have not yet learned that some days require a different kind of motion. He had ridden back from the worst defeat in Roman history. He had arrived at a city that was going to continue. He did not know what to do with this. He had expected the defeat to be visible in the city the way it was visible in him. He had expected the city to show the weight of it the way he showed the weight of it. He had ridden 4 days carrying the weight of what happened at Cannae. The city was carrying that weight too, in some way that did not show. He walked through the Subura toward his house. The Subura was quieter than ordinary days. Not silent, never silent, but quieter, a layer of something under the ordinary noise. You had to listen for it, and it was there. The women watched him pass. Some of them knew who he was. He had been consul. Before the appointment, before the campaign, he had walked this district. He was not from the Subura. He was not from the streets of poor men. But he had walked these streets as a candidate. He had spoken here. He had made promises here in the specific way that candidates make promises to people whose votes they need. These women knew his face. He walked past one of them. A woman at a doorway, older. She had the hands of a woman who had worked since before she could remember. She was looking at him. Not the way the others were looking at him. The others looked and looked away. She kept looking. He met her eyes. She said nothing. He kept walking. He thought. She had a son in the formation, or a husband, or a brother, someone in the ranks who had stood in the compressed mass, who had pressed forward when he gave the order, who had done exactly what the consul ordered. Someone who had done exactly what the consul ordered and had not come back from it. He did not know if this was true. He assumed it. He kept walking. None of them said anything. He was alive. He had not despaired of the Republic. The Senate had come out to thank him for these 2 facts. He had 2 facts. He was going to spend a long time understanding what the 2 facts cost. He walked through the Subura. The smell of it, the sounds of it, the ordinary machinery of people who could not stop being ordinary because nothing in their circumstances allowed them to stop. They were in grief, and they were also here, in the street, in the doorways, at the stalls. He passed a woman standing at her doorway with a child on her hip. The woman was looking at the street, not at him, at some middle distance. The expression of a person who is receiving information that will take some time to receive completely. Her husband or son had been in the formation. He did not know this. He assumed it. He kept walking. He thought about the word the Senate had used. Not despair. He had not despaired. He had ridden south, organized the survivors, written the letter, ridden north. He had done all of these things without despairing. This was correct. He had done the correct things. He had also ordered the formation. He thought about this on the road through the Subura. He thought about both things at once. The way you think about two things that will not resolve. He had done the correct things after. He had made the decision that led to the day. He walked past the fuller's shop. He had passed the shop many times over the years. He knew the fuller by sight, a thin man with strong forearms from the work. The fuller was not outside today. The shop was operating. He could hear it operating. He could smell it. The smell of the chemicals they used. The same smell it always had. He passed the building where the grain merchant lived. The grain merchant was at his window on the first floor. He was looking down at the street, not at Varro, at the street, the expression of a man assessing something, calculating something. The grain merchant would know. He would have heard and calculated what a battle like Cannae meant for the grain supply, for the prices, for the routes and the timing. The grain merchant would be in the middle of a very long calculation. One that started when the first rider came through with the number. The grain merchant was still calculating. The market was still calculating. The city was still calculating. He walked through it. He thought about the formation one more time. He thought about Paulus, about the arguments in the planning sessions, about the 11 requests, about the voice in which those requests were made. Paulus had not argued with anger. He had argued with precision. He had made the case, and the case had been considered, and the case had not changed the plan. He had made the plan. Paulus had stayed in the field he had warned them about. These were the two facts. He was alive. He walked home. The city was still standing. That was enough to know for today. Chapter 2. What the Senate did not do. The messenger from Hannibal arrived on the 5th day. His name was Carthalo. He was a Carthaginian officer. He carried formal credentials. He carried a written message. He was received at the city gates under a flag of negotiation. This was the correct protocol. Rome observed the correct protocol even under these circumstances. He was not allowed inside the walls. This was also the correct protocol. Rome's protocol for enemy messengers was very clear. They were received. They were heard. They were given food and water and shelter outside the walls. They were not permitted to enter. They were escorted back to the road when the business was done. This protocol existed for a reason. Cities that let enemy messengers inside their walls were cities already thinking about terms. They were cities that had begun the conversation about what comes after fighting. The conversation that begins when a city has decided, in some part of itself, that it might not win. Rome was not thinking about terms. He waited outside. The gate was made of oak and iron. It was very large. It had been here for a long time. It was still here. That was the information Carthalo took from it. The 5th day in summer in Rome is hot by mid-morning. Carthalo sat on a wooden bench under the temporary structure they had built for him outside the gate. The bench was Roman work, solid, built to last longer than one use. The Romans built things to last longer than one use. He had noticed this in other places. The roads, the bridges, the supply structures behind their camps. All of it built slightly more than necessary. He thought about this while he waited. He was a professional messenger, and he had learned to think about things while he waited. Not about the message. Not about the outcome. If you thought about the outcome, you began to hope, and hoping was a specific kind of inattention. You watched the gate too carefully. You read the movements of guards as signals when they were not signals. You lost the ability to read the actual signals when they came. He thought about other things instead. He thought about the oak and iron gate. He thought about Roman roads. He had traveled on them coming north from Cannae. There were 5 bodies of men going north on the road the morning of the battle. 5 separate groups in good order, moving at a measured pace. Not fleeing. Moving. There was a difference. Fleeing was a specific kind of movement. These men were not fleeing. They were repositioning. The speed. With their weapons. He had made a note of this. He had not been asked to make notes. But he made them anyway. Hannibal made notes. Hannibal had taught him something about messengers. A messenger who noticed only what he was sent to deliver delivered only half the information. The Rome behind this gate had sent the army to the Cannae plain. It was the same Rome. He made a note of this. He knew this. He sat with it. A century of guards was assigned to Carthalos' position. This was standard practice. The century was not unfriendly. They did not mistreat him or his escort. They provided what was required. Water and food and shelter under a temporary structure outside the gate. They spoke with him when he spoke to them. They did not speak when he did not. Carthalo waited. He was a professional. He had been in difficult positions before. A messenger carrying terms that the other party might not accept was always in a difficult position. He had learned to manage this by focusing on the thing he could control. He could control how he presented himself, how he waited, the manner in which he held the message while the other party decided what to do with it. He waited correctly. Inside the walls, the Senate was meeting. He could not hear the Senate from outside the walls. He could hear the city. Rome had a specific sound from outside the walls. He had heard it described by men who had been here before. He was hearing it now. The sound of a very large city going about its business. The carts. The voices. The bells. The particular weight of a large population in a confined space producing a continuous background that was not silence. Rome had lost 50,000 men 5 days ago. Sounded like this. He thought about this while he waited. The message he carried said this. Hannibal held prisoners. The number was large. 8,000 was the estimate. Roman citizens and Italian allies, taken in the fighting at Cannae and in the days after. They were alive. They were in adequate condition. Hannibal was willing to discuss their return. For a price. The price was to be negotiated. This was the opening position. He knew it was an opening position. Hannibal knew it was an opening position. The Senate of Rome, when they read it, would know it was an opening position. Negotiations began with opening positions. Everyone understood this. Rome did not negotiate with opening positions. He did not know this yet. He was about to learn it. The 8,000 were in a camp south of Cannae. He had seen them before he left. He had walked through the camp. It was a large camp. Hannibal had ordered it set up correctly. Adequate water, shade structures, medical attention for the wounded. The prisoners were being treated in the way that men being considered for return should be treated. Hannibal was not sentimental about this. He was practical. Men treated badly in captivity came home angry. Angry men were difficult to manage politically. They became advocates for harder war. Hannibal was not interested in creating more advocates for harder war inside Rome. Men treated adequately came home relieved. Relief was a different kind of politics. There were 8,000 of them in various conditions. Roman citizens and Italian allies. Centurions and standard-bearers and common soldiers. Cavalry who had broken through and been caught in the pursuit. Men who had fought at the center of the pocket and come out through a gap that closed behind them. They had given their names and their units. The tally had been organized. 8,000 and some when the count was done. They were alive. He waited. The Senate met the following morning. Inside the chamber, the summer heat. August in Rome. The smell of many men in a stone room that does not breathe well. They had been meeting constantly since the news arrived. Each session added to the list. The war required continuous decision, and the Senate was the body that made the decisions. Carthalo waited outside. The men who argued for negotiation spoke first. A senior senator from one of the old families. He had been in this chamber for 35 years. He had seen Rome in crisis before. He had seen the debates that followed Trebia and Trasimene. He had watched the city absorb each loss and continue. He was not a man who panicked. He said, "The prisoners are Roman soldiers. They served Rome at Cannae. They are not at fault for the outcome. They are alive. They can be returned. They can fight again." He said, "Rome needs soldiers. 8,000 soldiers is a substantial number." He said, "The cost can be managed. War always has costs. We have managed costs before." He sat down. The argument was real. Every man in the room knew that 8,000 soldiers was a real number. Every man in the room knew what it meant to have lost 50,000 men 5 days ago. The arithmetic of armies was not complicated. 8,000 men available meant 8,000 men available. 8,000 men sold or worked to death in Carthaginian farms. 8,000 men who would never carry Roman weapons again. The argument for payment was not made by foolish men. The argument for payment was made by men who understood exactly what 8,000 Roman soldiers were worth. The first senator stood again. He said, "I hear the argument about strategy. I understand the argument about strategy. I am making a different argument. I am asking what Rome owes the men who fought at Cannae." The room was quiet for a moment. He said, "Those men did not choose their position in the formation. They did not choose to press into the center when the center was designed to move. They did not have the information their commanders did not have. They stood and fought and were taken. That is what happened to them." He said, "Rome sends men to fight on its behalf. If Rome abandons captured men, Rome makes a statement. To every man it will ever ask to fight. The statement is, you fight alone." He said the word statement with the specific emphasis of a man who has thought about it carefully, who knows the word is the right word. He sat down. The room held this. He had made a different argument. Not the arithmetic of armies. The question of what Rome was in relation to the men who served it. Whether the city's obligation to its soldiers survived capture. This argument was also real. The men who argued against payment spoke next. A different senator. Younger. From a different kind of family. He had fewer years in the chamber, but he had been watching the war with specific attention. He had studied Hannibal the way you study an opponent you are not yet sure how to defeat. He said, "Hannibal came to Italy with a plan. The plan was to make Rome's allies abandon Rome. The plan was to demonstrate that Roman armies could be destroyed. The plan was to make the war expensive enough that Rome would seek terms. Every step of this plan has worked so far." He said, "Paying ransom tells Hannibal that it is working. It tells him that destroying Roman armies produces profit. It tells him that Rome will pay when Rome is hurt." He said, "Do not teach him this lesson. The lesson costs more than the prisoners." He sat down. The room was quiet. Both arguments were real. They were not the same real. One was about the value of 8,000 men. One was about the shape of the war. Both were completely serious. Fabius Maximus sat in his assigned position. He had been coming to this chamber for 40 years. He did not speak for a long time. He had learned across 40 years that there was a time to speak, and a time to wait, to watch the room, to understand where the room was going. He had learned that speaking too early shaped the debate in a way that benefited the other side. He had learned that a man who speaks at the right moment changes the vote. He waited. He listened. He watched the room. He knew what was going to happen. He had known since Carthalo arrived at the gate. He had known since he read the terms of the message. He had known since he understood what Hannibal was doing with the message. Hannibal had constructed a situation. This was what Hannibal did. He constructed situations and let the other party enter them. The situation was this. Rome could pay and feel the cost of paying. Or Rome could refuse and feel the cost of refusing. Either way, there was a cost. Hannibal had ensured there was a cost either way. He had constructed it so that both paths led through pain. Fabius waited until it was his turn. He stood. He said, "I believe the men who argue against payment are correct. I hold this view not because I am certain it is the right decision. I am not certain. 8,000 men are 8,000 men. They are real." He paused. The room waited. He said, "I hold this view because I believe Hannibal constructed this situation specifically to extract that payment. He is watching to see what we do. The one thing we cannot afford is to confirm to him that his construction was correct." He paused again. He said one more thing. He said, "I am also aware that 8,000 men will pay for this decision with their lives. I do not say this is not a cost. I say it is a cost we must pay." He sat down. The room was quiet for longer this time. Then the vote was called. No ransom. Carthalo was given the Senate's answer and escorted to the road south. He received the answer correctly. He was a professional. He said what needed to be said and nothing more. He was escorted to the road. He rode south. He would carry the answer to Hannibal in Capua. Inside the walls, the Senate had decided. 8,000 soldiers and allies would not be coming home. That was what the decision meant in its practical reality. 8,000 men who had survived the battle on the Cannae plain would not survive what came after. They would be sold or they would be killed. The Senate had made this decision without meeting those men, without knowing their names, without asking what they thought of it. The Senate had the authority to make this decision. It made it. Fabius walked home from the session in the late afternoon. Not quickly. He walked the way a man walks when he needs to think and the thinking requires movement and space. When the inside of a building is not large enough for the kind of thinking required. The city around him. August afternoon in Rome. The heat still in the stones. The smell of the day's commerce ending. The stalls closing. The sellers packing their boards. He thought about the 8,000 men. He had known some of their officers. He had served with some of their tribunes. He had reviewed units on past campaigns that had fed into the armies that went south to Cannae. He had looked at the men in those units. He had spoken to some of them. He had noted some of them. He had voted against ransoming them. He walked past the Temple of Saturn, the afternoon light on the columns. He had walked past this temple hundreds of times. This time he stopped. He stood in front of it for a moment. He thought about what he had said in the session. He had said what he believed. He had said it in the plainest language he could use. He had said it without oratory or the kind of persuasion that uses emotion as its tool. He had stated his position and his reasoning. He had believed what he said. He also thought about the 8,000 men. Both things were true at once. The argument against payment was correct. He had believed it before the vote and he believed it now. Hannibal had built the situation to extract a response. The response that confirmed his strategy was effective would fund the next battle. The one after that. The 8,000 men were also real. They had been in the formation. They had pressed forward in the compressed mass. They had done what Roman soldiers do. They had not done anything differently from the men beside them who died rather than being captured. They were alive because of where they happened to be in the formation. Not because of anything they chose. He walked past the Temple of Saturn. He walked through the market district, closed stalls, the smell of bread, the day's fish, a market after the market has finished. He thought about what he had voted for. He had voted for the correct policy. He was quite certain of this. He was also certain that 8,000 men were going to die because of it. These two things were both true. He was going to carry them both. He walked home. The city was still standing. He thought, it will be standing tomorrow, and the day after. Rome will still be here after this. He believed this. He walked home and believed it. The 8,000 men were also not going to be here. He carried that too. He walked past the Curia, the building where the Senate met. He had been inside that building thousands of times across 40 years. He knew which floor tile was uneven near the third bench on the left. He knew which pillar gave the best acoustics at conversational volume. He knew the section of wall that held the cold even in August. He had voted in that room for every major decision Rome had made in his adult lifetime. He stood outside it for a moment. Inside, the tile was still uneven. These things were not changed by Cannae. The building did not know what had happened at Cannae. Buildings do not know. He thought about what 8,000 men looked like. He had reviewed armies. He knew what 8,000 men in formation looked like from a reviewing position. The sound of 8,000 men responding to an order. The smell of a formation of 8,000 men who have been in the field. He had voted to not bring those men home. He had voted correctly. He walked on. He arrived home. He ate what was prepared. He sat for a while in the inner room. He thought about the 8,000 men for a specific period of time. He allowed this. He did not look away from it. He let the thought be present. He did not resolve it. He did not make it smaller. Then he set it aside. Not because it was resolved, because the morning would require decision and the night required sleep. He went to sleep, without difficulty, the way he always slept. A campaign skill learned young and never lost. The 8,000 men were still not coming home. He would be awake at the correct hour. The war would still be there. He would be there too. Chapter 3. The men at Canusium. The survivors went to Canusium. Not all of them. The ones who could walk. The ones who found a horse. The ones who attached themselves to someone going in the right direction. They came into the town over 2 days. The first ones arrived while it was still light on the day of the battle. Cavalry who had broken through the Numidian line on the left. Men who had been in positions at the edges of the formation. Men who had been on assignment away from the main body when the pocket closed. They came in small groups moving fast. Some of them were still carrying weapons. Some of them had lost the weapons and were carrying nothing. They arrived at the edge of Canusium. The town received them the way towns receive unexpected things. Carefully, with the immediate practical questions first. Where had they come from? What had happened? How many were coming? The practical questions before the larger ones. The larger ones could wait until there was information enough to answer them. There was not yet information enough. The second wave came through the night. Not cavalry. Men on foot. Moving at the pace of men who have been through something large. Who have a destination. Who are not sure they will reach it. They moved in the dark on roads they were not entirely sure of. They used the river as a guide. The Aufidus runs south of Canusium. If you follow the river west and north you reach the town. They followed the river. Some of them had been in the pocket and gotten out through the gaps before the gaps closed. Some of them had been at the edge of the formation when it finally broke and had run. Some of them had been in the units that broke early. The units on the outside that had not pressed deep into the center. They had survived. This was the fact they carried. They had been in the formation. They had been at Cannae. They had survived while a very large number of the men with them had not survived. The reason for the difference was not, in most cases, about anything they had done differently. It was about position, about which century you were in when the pocket formed, about where you happened to be standing on the Cannae plain on the morning of the 2nd of August. You do not choose your century. Some of them had no reason they could identify. They were just not dead. This was the weight they were carrying when they came into Canusium. Among them was a man from the Italian allies. He had been on the left wing when the Numidian cavalry struck. He had survived the cavalry engagement because he was not cavalry. He was attached infantry. He had been in the position where the Allied cavalry broke. He had run with the men who ran. He had kept running until the running stopped being running and became something else. Became moving. Moving in the direction of not that. He came into Canusium on the 2nd day. He did not know anyone in Canusium. He had no friends in this town. He had no family within 2 days' ride. He sat on the steps of a building on the main road and looked at the town. He had been in the legions for 6 years. He had served in 2 campaigns before this one. He had survived both of them. He knew how surviving felt. Felt like this, like sitting on steps in a town you did not know, not being certain what the next correct thing to do was. He sat on the steps. Another man sat down beside him. He did not know this man either. He had never seen this man before the plain below Cannae. He had not seen this man on the plain below Cannae. He did not know which unit this man had been in, or where on the field he had been when the pocket formed. They sat beside each other. They did not speak for a long time. Then the man beside him said, "Where were you when it closed?" He told him, "Left wing. The cavalry broke." He ran with the cavalry. He kept going. The man beside him said, "Center. 3rd rank." He had been in the 3rd rank when the pocket formed. He did not know how he had gotten out. He said this clearly. He had been in the 3rd rank when the pocket formed. Now he was sitting on steps in Canusium. He did not know how he had gotten from one place to the other. They sat with this, the man from the left wing and the man from the 3rd rank of the center, on the steps of a building in Canusium, neither of them knowing the other's name. This is the kind of thing that does not go into the sources. The historians had larger things to record. The historians were correct to record the larger things. But this was also what Cannae looked like. 2 days later, in a town in southern Italy, on the steps of a building, 2 men sitting beside each other and not knowing each other's names. A woman in Canusium named Busa opened her houses to them. She was wealthy. She had the wealth of a family that had been in Canusium for several generations, that had accumulated land and grain and connections, the kind of resources that come from staying in one place long enough, managing what you have carefully enough. She had these resources. When the soldiers arrived in her town, she responded. She did not wait for someone to ask her. She did not wait for an official request. She looked at what had arrived in her town and she understood what was needed and she provided it. She opened the grain stores. She had clothing brought out. She had the houses prepared. She organized the women of her household to distribute food. She asked for nothing in return. This is in the sources. Her name is in the sources because the historians wrote it down. They wrote it down because what she did was the kind of thing that deserved to be written. In a war generating many things that needed to be written, they found space for her name. The survivors ate. They slept. They did the ordinary things the body requires. The body does not adjust its requirements for the significance of what has just happened. It requires food. It requires sleep. It requires water. Busa had the food. She had the water. She had the roofs. The survivors used them. They did not talk much at first. The silence that settles over men who have survived something large is specific. It is not peaceful. It is not restful. It is the silence of a thing that has not yet been processed, of something too large to put into language yet. The mind circles around it, approaches it and retreats, tries to find a way in that does not feel like falling. They sat in Buse's houses and in the streets of Canusium. They were in this silence. The silence lasted a day. Then some of them began to talk, in low voices at first, then louder, about where they had been when specific things happened, about the men who were not here, about the shape of the day, about what they had seen and not seen. The conversations had the quality of men who are trying to understand something by saying it out loud, who are looking for the shape of the thing by describing it to someone else who was also there, who might be able to confirm the shape or adjust it or add a piece that fills in a gap. These conversations went on through the evening of the first day. Some of them ended in silence again. Some of them ended in other kinds of understanding. On the second day, some of the officers talked about leaving Italy. They met in a house near the center of the town. Men of rank. Men who could organize and command. They had assessed the situation the way men of their training assess situations. They had looked at the available information. The available information was this. Rome had lost an army. The largest army Rome had ever assembled. It was gone. Hannibal was in the south of Italy and had demonstrated that the Italian plain was his fighting ground. Rome had no force sufficient to stop him in the open field. What remained available to Rome was not enough. They talked about what to do with this information. Some of them talked about finding ships. Italy had ports. There were ships. A group of men with rank and connections could arrange passage, could go to Sicily, could go to Sardinia, could go somewhere that was not Italy while Italy worked out what it was going to do. They talked about this. They used the word options. They said, we must consider all options. They said, to stay in Italy with what remains is not useful to Rome. They said, surviving officers are more valuable than dead ones. They said these things in the careful language of men building a reason for something before committing to it. One of the men had been at Trebia. He had survived Trebia. He had survived Trasimene. He was now at Canusium. He had survived 3 of the worst days of the war. He had the specific quality of a man who has survived bad things. He knew how to read the odds. He had been reading them his entire military career and had been correct more than he had been wrong. The odds said, leave. He was the one who said ships first. He said it clearly. He did not wrap it in the language of options. He said, we should find ships. He said, nothing we can do in Italy right now is more useful to Rome than surviving. He said, surviving officers outside Italy are better than dead officers in it. He said this in the voice of a man who had survived 3 battles by reading the odds correctly. The room listened. Some of them were nodding, not loudly, the kind of nod that is not agreement but is permission for the idea to stay in the room, to take up space and be considered. Another man spoke. He spoke in the same voice, the same careful language of options and survival and practical thinking. He said, there are ports. He said, Sicilian grain ships are always present this time of year. He said, I know the port commander at Rhegium. He said these things as if he was already halfway through the problem, as if the decision had been made and they were now in the planning stage. The room was mostly in agreement. Not completely. Some of them were not speaking. Some of them were listening to the others with an expression that was not agreement and was not yet disagreement. One of them was a man named Appius Claudius Pulcher. He had not spoken. He had been in the room since the meeting began. He was older than Scipio. He had rank. He had not said anything about ships. He was looking at the floor. His expression said he was unhappy with everything being said. He had not yet found the words for it. He was looking for the words. He did not find them. Then the door opened. A young officer came in. His name was Publius Cornelius Scipio. He was the son of the consul who had commanded at Trebia. He was 18 years old, maybe 19. The sources are not precise. He had been at Cannae in a junior capacity. He had survived. He was not large. He was not the most senior man in the room. He did not have the rank to command anyone present. He had a sword. He had heard about the meeting. He had not been invited. He stood in the doorway. The room looked at him. The men in the room were senior to him. Some of them had been in the legions before he was born. Some of them had commanded units at 3 different postings. They were looking at a junior officer who had come into a private meeting with a sword. He said nothing for a moment. He looked at the room. He had the quality that a room pays attention to, before the right has been earned. Not everyone has this quality. It is not about size or rank or the loudness of the voice. It is something less definable. The room pays attention because something in the room has decided to pay attention. The room was paying attention. He said, "Who among you will swear with me to not abandon the Republic?" He said it with his hand on the sword. One of the senior officers said, "This meeting is private." Scipio looked at him. He said, "I know." He said, "Who will swear?" The room was quiet. The senior officer who had spoken was looking at this young man. He was doing the calculation. A junior officer had entered a private meeting with a drawn sword and made a demand. In the ordinary world, this would have a clear response. In the ordinary world, rank and protocol and the proper channels had clear answers to this kind of thing. This was not the ordinary world. This was Canusium, the second day after Cannae. The ordinary world was on the plain south of here. He looked at the young man. He did not speak. Scipio said it a 3rd time. They swore. Not all at once. One at a time. The way things happen when a room full of people changes direction. First one man, then another, then the silence breaking, the calculation changing. He put the sword away. The meeting about leaving Italy was over. He went out and found the other survivors. The ones in the streets. The ones in Buse's houses. He walked among them. He was 18 years old. He had the quality the room paid attention to. He was walking through Canusium telling tired men to pick up the weapons. He said, "We are still here." He said, "One battle does not decide a war." He said, "Pick up the weapons." He said these things in the voice of someone who believed them and expected to be believed. They picked up the weapons. This is in the sources. Polybius recorded this. Livy recorded this. They recorded it because it was the moment the army that would eventually win the war began. Not at Zama, where the war ended. Not in Spain, where the reinforcements would come from. Here, in a town in southern Italy, with a young officer and a sword and the survivors of the worst day in Roman military history. They picked up the weapons. The man who had been thinking about ships was one of them. He stood in the room for a moment after the others had filed out. He had been building an argument for several hours. It had been a reasonable argument, based on real information, real odds. The odds had not changed since he started building it. He had stopped building it. He was not certain why. He looked at the space where the young officer had been standing. He looked at the door the others had gone through. He picked up his weapons. He followed them. It was not dramatic. It was organizational. For 1,000 men needed to be counted, assessed, reorganized. They needed officers assigned to them. They needed a chain of command. They needed a supply line. They needed to know what came next. Appius Claudius took 1/2. Scipio took the other. They went through the survivors the way experienced officers go through survivors. Systematically. What unit? What rank? What condition? Are you wounded? Can you march? What weapons do you have? The answers came back. Mixed. Some of them were in good condition. Some of them were not. Some had weapons. Some had nothing. Some of the Italian Allied soldiers had come in with full kit. They were sitting, waiting for someone to tell them what to do. They were told what to do. The chain of command assembled itself. Not quickly, not cleanly, the way things assemble when the normal structure has been disrupted. People found their level. Officers found men. Men found officers. Took 2 days. At the end of 2 days there was a force. Not the force they had been. Not a force sufficient to fight Hannibal in the open field. But a force. A thing with structure. With officers. With a line of supply. With a direction to face. This happened at Canusium. Before the Senate in Rome had made its decisions. Before the letters went out. Before the next consuls were chosen. The army did not wait for Rome. The army started at Canusium. It started with a young officer and a sword. For 1,000 men who had been sitting in a town. Not an army yet. Then they were an army. The historians wrote this down. Not because it was a large event on the scale of the battle. It was a small event. A young officer and a sword. A room of senior men who had been thinking about ships. A town in Apulia with a woman named Busa who had opened her grain stores. The historians wrote it down because small events at the right moment changed the direction of the thing. This was the right moment. The man from the left wing picked up the weapons. So did the man from the third rank. They had been sitting on steps. They had not been thinking about weapons. They had been doing the work of sitting with what had happened and trying to understand the shape of it. Then a young officer walked through. He was 18 or 19 years old. He had been at Cannae. He did not look like a man who had been at Cannae. He looked like a man who had decided something and was moving in the direction of the decision. He stopped at several places in the town. He said the same things at each stop. We are still here. One battle does not decide a war. Pick up the weapons. The man from the left wing looked at him. He looked at the weapons on the ground near the steps. Not his weapons. Someone else's weapons. Left behind when their owner stopped needing them. He had been looking at those weapons since he sat down. He picked them up. He did not think about this carefully. He did not reason through it. He looked at the weapons. He looked at the young officer. He looked at the man beside him. He picked up the weapons. The man from the third rank picked up weapons too. They did not discuss it. They stood up from the steps. The young officer was already moving on to the next group. They followed him. This is not in the sources. This is the kind of thing the sources cannot record because the sources do not know these two men's names. But this is also what happened at Canusium. Somewhere in the record of Polybius and Livy, these two men are counted. They are part of the 4,000 who gathered at Canusium. They are part of the number that eventually became the army. That went to Spain, then to Africa, then to Zama. They are in the number. The number is in the sources. The army that would beat Hannibal started here. Not with the weapons. With the decision behind the weapons. Rome was still standing. This was why. The ground is not settled by the number of the dead. The ground is settled by what the living decide to do the day after. The living in Canusium decided. They picked up the weapons. Chapter 4. Fabius in Rome. The day Fabius heard about Cannae, he went to the temple of Jupiter. He went alone. He went in the morning before the crowds. The temple opened at the first light for those who needed it. He needed it. He stood inside for a long time in the cool interior of the building. He had nothing particular to ask for. He was not there to pray for a specific thing. He was there because he needed a large, quiet space. The temple was a large, quiet space. He stayed for perhaps an hour. He stood in the interior and looked at the cult statue. He had been looking at this statue since he was a young man. He had stood in this specific position many times. The position gave you a view of the full height of the statue, at a distance that allowed you to see the whole form. He had found this position as a young man when he was new to this temple. He had returned to the position across 40 years. The statue had not changed. He had changed. He stood in his position and looked at the statue and did not ask for anything. He was past the age when he asked for things. He had asked for things as a young man. He had found that asking did not produce the things asked for in any reliable correlation. He had found that the asking was not the point. The point was something else. The standing. The specific quality of attention required by standing in a quiet space with nothing to do. He stood. He thought about Cannae. He had been thinking about Cannae for 30 years. Not specifically. Not this battle specifically. He had been thinking about the problem that Cannae represented. The problem of Hannibal on a flat plain in Italy. He had thought about it when no one else was thinking about it yet. He had thought about it in the Senate when they were still debating whether to take the war to Spain. He had thought about it when Hannibal crossed the Pyrenees, when he crossed the Alps, when he fought Trebia, when he fought Trasimene. He had always known this was coming. Not this exact day, not this exact plain, but something like this. A day when Hannibal fought on his terms. When Rome fought on Hannibal's terms. The result was what you get when a side fights on the other side's terms. He had known. He had not stopped it. He stood in the temple and held both of these facts. Then he walked home. He walked slowly. He walked the way a man walks when something very large has just happened. When walking is the only available response. When you cannot sit still and you cannot run, and so you walk. At whatever pace the body chooses. Until the body decides it has walked enough. The city around him in the morning. He had been right. He had said, "Do not fight Hannibal on the open plain." He had said, "Do not let him choose the ground." He had said, "Starve him, harass him, deny him the engagement he is looking for." He had said this in the Senate and in private, to anyone who asked. To several people who had not asked. They had called him cunctator. They had meant it as contempt. The delayer. The man who would not fight. The man who watched from the hills while Hannibal burned the farms below and the Senate demanded he act. He had not acted in the way they demanded. They had replaced him with Minucius, then with Varro. They had gone south to the flat plain. He had been right. He walked through Rome in the days after the news arrived and he felt nothing about being right. This surprised him. He had not expected to feel satisfaction, but he had expected to feel something. Some version of the thing that arrives when a prediction proves correct. When you said the thing and the thing happened and the world confirmed what you knew. He felt nothing like that. What he felt was this. 47,000 men were dead on a plain in Apulia. He had known many of their officers. He had served with some of them. He had trained some of them. He had reviewed their units on past campaigns. He had spoken to some of the men. He had looked at their faces. He had been right and they were dead. He walked through the Subura. The Subura after Cannae was specific. He had been through the Subura many times. The densest district, the noisiest, the district that did not have the luxury of quiet, or controlled expression, or the carefully managed grief of the Palatine houses. He had walked through the Subura at many hours over 40 years of public life. He had never walked through it like this. The women were out. Not all of them. The ones who knew. The ones who had men in the formations. The ones who had been doing the arithmetic since the riders came through. The ones who had sons who were the right age for the legions and had gone south with the army. He walked through them. One woman was sitting on the step outside her building. She was not doing anything. She was not looking at anything in particular. She had her hands in her lap. She had the expression of someone who has received information that the mind is still sorting, who is sitting in the place where the information arrived and waiting for the sorting to finish. He did not stop. He was a consul once, a dictator once, a senior senator now. He did not stop. He had nothing to say that would be worth stopping for. He had no comfort to offer that would not be made smaller by saying it. He walked past her. He walked past a man leading a cart. The man's face had the shape of someone awake too long, concentrating on the task of moving the cart. The cart was full of bread. He was delivering bread. On the day after the news arrived, this man was delivering bread. The city was operating. Fabius had expected it to stop. He had not expected it to stop entirely, but he had expected some slowdown, some acknowledgement in the operations of the city that something very large had happened. He had expected to see it in the rhythm of the streets, in the timing of the markets, in the faces of the men at the stalls. The city was operating at the same speed it always operated. The bread was being delivered. The fuller's shop was doing the fuller's work. The children of the Suburra were running somewhere in an alley with the energy that children have regardless. He had walked through this district for 40 years. He was walking through it now. It looked the same as it always looked, and something about it was entirely different. He could not see what was different. He could feel it. The Senate passed the measures quickly. Speed was correct. He did not argue about speed. The mourning period was the first measure. 30 days. Standard. The Senate had voted it and the city had observed it. The women had mourned at home. The rites had been performed. The families with men in the formations had their 30 days. Then the mourning period ended and the city resumed. This was not callousness. He had thought about this carefully. He had been in the Senate when the vote on the mourning period happened. He had voted for it. He had also seen what it was: a structure, a container, a defined period. During that period, grief had its space, its form, its recognized place in the city. And then the container closed. Not because the grief was over. The grief was not over. Some of these families would not finish grieving until they were dead themselves. The container closed because Rome could not survive an unlimited mourning period. There was a difference between acknowledging that and not caring about it. He had voted for the measure. He had walked home. He had sat in the room where he worked, not working, for a long time. He had let himself feel what the measure cost. Then he had gone back to work. The city had also passed a second measure more quietly. Women were not to gather in public to receive the news. In the days after the first riders came through, groups of women gathered. At the forum, at the city gates, at the temples, mothers of soldiers, wives, sisters. The information was arriving. It was about their families. The only way to receive it was to be where it was arriving. So they gathered there. The Senate had recognized this as a problem. Not the grief, the gathering. Women gathering in public to receive news of a catastrophe. That was a specific kind of visible fear. Fear was contagious in ways that strength was not. A city could demonstrate strength quietly. It required very few gestures. The women needed to receive their news. But the city could not afford the spectacle of public grief on the scale that Cannae's losses required. The measure was passed. Women were to receive news at home. The reports would come to them. He had voted for this measure too. He had walked home and thought about what the women in the Suburra would receive at home. what the messenger would say at the door, what the door would sound like closing afterward. He thought about this for a specific period of time. Then he set it aside. This was what 40 years in the Senate looked like. Not the speeches or the victories or the names that went into the record. This was what it looked like. Voting for things that worked. Carrying what they cost. Going to the next session. The age limits were adjusted first. The men too young and the men too old. The line moved in both directions. Men who had been turned away for age were recalled. Men who had not yet reached the standard age were accepted. The army had lost 50,000. The army needed bodies that could hold a weapon. The age limits were adjusted. Then the prisoners, men convicted of minor offenses, offered freedom in exchange for service. This had been done before in smaller ways. The principle was established. The application here was larger than before. Then the slaves, 8,000 slaves, volunteers. He thought about the word volunteer for a long time. A slave who volunteers when the alternative is continued slavery makes a different kind of choice. Not the same as a free man who volunteers. Both are choices. They are not the same choice. He thought about this. He did not raise it in the session. He voted for the measure. He watched the training grounds outside the city in the weeks after the vote. The new legions forming. Officers he knew receiving units they would not have received 6 months ago. The freed men in their new equipment, standing in formations, learning the interval, learning the commands. Not elegant. The commands were sometimes slow to be obeyed. The interval was sometimes not precise. They were learning. He had seen men learn before. He knew what the early stages looked like. He knew what effective looked like at the end of the process. Elegant and effective were different things. He had spent 40 years understanding the difference. He watched them. He thought, this will work. Not quickly, not easily, but it will work. These men will fight. Not the way the legions of 15 years ago fought, but they will fight. He had seen enough of war to know what made a formation. It was not where the men came from. It is what happens to them in the field. The field will make them. He watched them train and believed this. He went to the training grounds 3 times in the weeks after the vote. He did not need to go. He had his role in the Senate sessions. He had the consulting position. He had the work that needed doing. The training grounds were not his responsibility. He went because he needed to see it. He stood at the edge of the training ground on the first day and watched the formations taking shape. The freed men in their new equipment. The equipment did not fit all of them correctly. The smiths had been working continuously since the vote. The equipment was good Roman equipment. It was not always sized correctly for the men wearing it. This would be corrected over time. He watched the officers he knew working with units he had not expected to see them working with. Good officers. Officers he had served with on campaigns. Officers who knew what a formation was supposed to look like when it was working. They were patient. He had not been certain they would be patient. Patience with new soldiers was a specific skill. It was different from patience in the field. In the field, patience meant waiting for the correct moment. With new soldiers, patience meant explaining the same thing 6 times, in 6 different ways, watching which way worked, using that way again. The officers he watched were doing this. He did not know where they had learned to be patient with new soldiers. He assumed they had learned it the way you learn things in this life. By needing to, he went back on the second day. The formations were slightly better. Not elegant. Better. The interval was more consistent. The response time to commands was slightly faster. These were small improvements. They were the correct small improvements for this stage. He went back on the 3rd day. On the 3rd day, he saw a specific thing. He saw a freed man who had learned the gladius stance. The stance was a thing that took most Roman soldiers several weeks to learn correctly. The balance point, the angle of the weapon in relation to the body, the specific way the front knee bent and the back foot planted and the shield arm positioned. Most soldiers learned a version of it in the first week. The correct version took longer. This man had the correct version. On the third day, he stood and watched this man for a moment. He thought, "This man has been watching the other soldiers. He has been watching and teaching himself. He came to this ground not knowing the stance. He is leaving it knowing the stance. 3 days," he thought, "the field will make them." He walked home from the training ground on the third day with more certainty than he had arrived with. Not certainty about the war, certainty about this formation, about these men, about what men do when they are given weapons and an enemy in time. They become soldiers. One afternoon he left the session early and walked home through the forum. He stopped at the edge of it. He had done this before. He had stood at the edge of the forum many times across 40 years. It was not a deliberate habit. It was something his feet did. They had learned the forum. They knew where to stop. He stopped. He looked at the space. The afternoon light on the columns of the Temple of Saturn. The long shadows of late afternoon. The particular quality of the light at this hour that turned the stone gold before the darkness came. He had been watching this light for 40 years. It looked the same. It was not the same. He had felt this on the day after the news arrived. The sense of something added to the space. Something that could not be seen. That could only be felt when you stood in the place long enough. The weight of what the city had gone through. The weight of what the city had refused to collapse under. He stood in the forum in the late afternoon. He thought about what Rome had done since the news arrived. He thought about the Senate going out to the gate for Varro. He thought about the vote against ransom and the cost of it. He thought about the new legions being raised, the slaves being armed, the men at Canusium picking up their weapons. He had believed for a long time that Rome would survive. He had believed it in the months when they were calling him cunctator and meaning it as an accusation. He had believed it when they replaced him and he watched from the hills while Hannibal burned the farms. He had believed it in every meeting where he was the minority. He had believed it. He had not fully understood it. He understood it now, not as an argument, as something else. Something from standing in the forum after Cannae, watching the bread delivered, the fuller's shop operating, the children running. Something from watching the women in the Scipio, the Senate voting, the slaves picking up weapons on the training grounds. He understood what the city was. Not the marble, not the walls, not the consular elections or the triumphs or the treaties. The other thing, the thing under all of that, the thing that had come out to the gate to thank a losing general for surviving, that had voted against ransom and paid the cost, that was in the Scipio making noise and at the stalls delivering bread and on the training ground becoming soldiers. He stood at the edge of the forum and understood it. He thought about Lucius Aemilius Paulus. He thought about the morning Paulus had come to the garden, the dead plant near the wall, the old man looking at it the way he looked at everything, the specific silence of a garden in early winter before anything has decided to be alive again. Paulus had asked, "Tell me what you see at Cannae." He had not answered. He had walked back through the dead plants. He had said nothing because the answer was not something you said to a man who was going to Cannae, who had been told he was going to Cannae and was going anyway. You did not say, "I see 47,000 men dead on a flat plain." You did not say that to a man who had already decided to go. He had been silent. The silence was the answer. Paulus had understood the silence. He had gone anyway. He had been the careful one. He had said what needed to be said in every room where it needed to be said. He had made every argument. He had filed every report. He had spent his disagreements on the things that mattered most. He had been overruled on all of them. He had stayed. He had been on foot in the center of the formation when Lentulus found him. He had sent Lentulus away with the message. He had shaken his head at the horse. He had stayed in the field he had warned them about. Fabius stood at the edge of the forum and thought about this. He thought about what kind of city had men like that in it. What kind of city produced a man on foot in the center of Cannae, left side broken, sending his rescuer away to carry a message? What kind of city? He had been trying to understand it for 40 years. He walked home. He had work to do. The war was not over. Chapter 5. The Wrong Calculation. Hannibal spent the autumn in Capua. Capua was the largest city in Italy after Rome itself. It had opened its gates to him after Cannae. No siege was necessary. The city had decided which side was winning. It had acted accordingly. He had taken up residence there. His army had winter quarters in the surrounding area. His officers were making the arrangements a large army in a friendly city required. The supply lines, the billeting agreements, the local officials who needed to be managed and the local officials who were already cooperative. The ordinary administrative work of an occupation that was also an alliance. He attended to it. He did the work because the work needed to be done, because doing it was the correct thing to do. His mind was elsewhere. His hands attended to the work. His mind was elsewhere. He was waiting. He had done the largest thing a general could do. He had done it completely and correctly and in a few hours on a flat plain. The formation had worked. The cavalry timing had worked. The African infantry rotation had worked. The Volturnus wind from the south had worked. The 23 days of positioning and adjustment had worked. The plan had worked exactly as designed. He was waiting for the consequence. The consequence was supposed to be a negotiation. The day after Cannae, his cavalry commander came to him. His name was Hannibal. He was the best cavalry officer in the army. He had been the best cavalry officer in the army since Spain. He had commanded the Numidian horse at Trebia. He had commanded them at Trasimene. At Cannae, he had led the Spanish and Gallic cavalry on the right wing. He had broken the Roman cavalry there in the first hour. He had ridden around the entire Roman formation. He had hit them from behind and ended the battle. Hannibal was the reason Cannae had worked. He came to the command tent on the morning after. He had slept 4 hours after a very large day. He had arrived with a plan. His expression said both things. He had been calculating through the night. He had his cavalry rested. He had the route. He had thought through the timing. He said, "Give me the cavalry. Give me the cavalry and 5 days. I will bring you Rome." He meant it exactly. He said, "I will ride to Rome before they recover, before they organize, before the new armies are raised, before Fabius tells them to wait on the hills. I will be at the walls before any of that happens." He had the route mapped. He had done the mathematics of cavalry speed over roads in August. He had done the calculation the way good cavalry commanders calculate. Precisely, with specific numbers. He believed the numbers were correct. Hannibal listened. He said nothing for a long time. He thought about what Hannibal was proposing, not the cavalry plan. He had already assessed the cavalry plan. He could see that the cavalry plan was militarily feasible. That was not the question. The question was Rome itself. He had studied Rome for 16 years. He had read the historians. He had spoken with traders who had been inside the walls. He had spoken with Roman prisoners from previous engagements. He had built a specific understanding of what Rome was. Rome was not a city that surrendered because an army appeared at its walls. He had built his entire strategy around not needing to take Rome by siege. A siege of Rome would take years. He did not have the siege equipment. He did not have the supply lines for a static siege of that duration. He did not have the reinforcements that Carthage should have sent and had not sent. He had built the strategy to make Rome negotiate, not to take Rome by force. He looked at Hannibal. He said, "I understand the plan." He said, "We are not going." Hannibal stood in the tent. He was not a man given to argument with his commander. He had served under Hannibal since Hannibal took command. He had followed the plan across 2 mountain ranges and 4 battles. He had delivered on the plan every time it was given to him. He said what he said. He said, "You know how to win a battle." A pause. He said, "You do not know how to use one." He left the tent. Hannibal stood in the tent after Hannibal left. He had heard what Hannibal said. He had understood what it meant. He held it. He thought, maybe. He also thought, Hannibal is wrong about what will end this war. He thought about Rome, not as a target, as a problem. He had been thinking about Rome as a problem for 16 years. The problem was not the walls. The walls could be taken with enough time and equipment. The problem was what Rome would do while you were taking them. Rome would raise more armies. Rome would raise new armies. From men too old. From men too young. From men convicted of crimes. From slaves. He had intelligence reports from 3 campaigns now. This was what Rome did. You destroyed an army and Rome raised another one. Hannibal's plan would work if Rome was the kind of city that stopped fighting when you appeared at its walls. He stood in the tent and held this problem. He was not certain Hannibal was wrong. He was not certain Hannibal was right. He was certain that the cavalry alone could not take the walls of Rome. That a cavalry force at the gates of Rome was not the same as Rome in negotiation. A prolonged static operation in front of Rome's walls. No supply, no siege equipment, Fabius on every hill behind him. He could not afford that. He was going to wait for Rome to negotiate. This is the calculation that historians have debated for 2,000 years. The specific decision, the specific morning, the cavalry in position, Hannibal in the tent, Hannibal saying, "We are not going." Whether he was right or wrong is not the interesting question. The interesting question is what he believed. He believed he had built a strategy that would make Rome negotiate. He believed at this moment that the strategy was working. He believed that Cannae was the final demonstration, that the demonstration had been sufficient. He had built 16 years of preparation around this belief. He was wrong. Not because the plan was foolish. The plan was not foolish. He had been correct about every part of it except one. He had been correct about the armies and the terrain and the battles. He had built correctly. He had calculated correctly. He had calculated the wrong thing about Rome. Rome should have sent someone by now. He waited. The messenger he sent came back. Carthalo, a good officer. He had given him the credentials and the terms and the instructions. Carthalo had gone to Rome and waited outside the walls and delivered the terms and waited for the answer. He received the messenger in his headquarters in Capua. He received the message. No ransom. He set the message down. He read it again. No ransom. No prisoners returned. No negotiation. Continue the war. He stood. He walked to the window. Capua in the autumn. Mild air. Green still in the gardens. Pleasant city. A city that had weighed its options and decided correctly. He had been generous to Capua. He had made clear the terms of the alliance. He had shown what the winning side looked like and what it offered, and Capua had chosen it. Capua had made the rational calculation. He had expected Rome to make the rational calculation. He thought about the mathematics. He had thought about this mathematics for years. He had studied it before the campaign. He had studied it on the march. He had refined it across 3 Italian winters and 4 major battles. The mathematics was this: an army loses a battle. The army is gone. The Allied cities begin to calculate. A city has obligations to Rome and obligations to its own survival. When Rome's army is destroyed, the calculation changes. The obligation to Rome weakens. The obligation to survival strengthens. Cities begin to leave. Then more cities leave. Then Rome is isolated. Then Rome negotiates. This was the pattern. He had built 16 years of preparation around this pattern. The pattern was working. 17 Italian cities had defected since Cannae. More were considering it. The defections were happening as he had calculated. Capua was the largest. Others would follow Capua. The pattern was working, except the last step. Rome had not sent negotiators. He thought about why. He walked through Capua in the afternoon, thinking about why. His guards at a respectful distance. The city around him doing what cities do. Commerce and noise. The ordinary business of people who have decided what side they are on. Living with the decision. He had calculated Rome as a city. He had known Rome was different. He had studied it. He had respected it. He had come to Italy specifically because Rome was the kind of city worth the effort. You did not cross the Alps for an ordinary opponent. You crossed the Alps for something that required crossing the Alps. He had known Rome was different. He had not known the nature of the difference. Most cities, after a defeat of this scale, sent someone to negotiate. They offered something: land, tribute, alliance, a change in the relationship. They found a path to the end of the fighting. This was the rational response. This was what intelligent people who valued their city did when the military situation became untenable. Rome had not done this. Rome had mourned for one day. Then Rome had raised new legions from men who had never served. From men too old. From prisoners. From slaves. Freeing slaves to fight was not something Rome did. They had done it. He had received the intelligence reports over the course of several weeks. Each report added a piece. He had put the pieces together. He had looked at what they added up to. He had looked at it for a long time. He had good intelligence. This was something he had built over years. He had agents in Rome. He had agents in the Allied cities. He had people who watched and reported. He had constructed this network before the campaign began. He had understood that the war would be decided partly in the field and partly by information. The information was good. The information said this: Rome's Senate met the day the news arrived and ordered a mourning period and then went back to work. The mourning period was real. The bread sellers opened at the correct hours. The moneylenders were at their tables. The river traffic continued. The city's administration continued without interruption. The information said, the Senate voted against ransom within a week. He had read this report 3 times. He had built the ransom situation specifically. He had known that Rome would face a choice between paying and not paying. He had built the choice so that both paths were painful. He had expected the Senate to make the pragmatic calculation. A Senate that had just lost 50,000 men in one morning. Return the soldiers. Fill the legions. Fight another day. The Senate had not made the pragmatic calculation. The Senate had made the strategic calculation. He had read this report 3 times and then he had set it down and looked at the window. He thought, they understood what I was doing. He thought, they understood it and refused to do it anyway. This was different from not understanding. He had been in negotiations with cities that did not understand what was happening to them. He had been in negotiations with cities that understood and complied anyway. He had not yet been in a negotiation with a city that understood exactly what was happening and refused. He thought about why a city would do this. He thought about the kind of city that does this. He had built his strategy around a city that calculated survival. A city that valued its people and buildings and future trade, more than the abstract question of who was winning the war. A city that, when the armies failed, sent the diplomats. He had been fighting a different kind of city. A city that thanked a losing general for surviving rather than punishing him. A city that voted against ransom and paid the cost. A city that armed its slaves. A city with women in the Suburra making noise in the streets. Bread sellers opening at the correct hours. The morning after 50,000 men died. He had seen this in the intelligence reports. Not the noise. The bread sellers. The markets operating. The Senate meeting continuously. The new formations being organized before the old ones were even counted. He had read these reports and thought about the kind of city. He had built his strategy around a city that would stop. He was fighting a city that did not know how to stop. He pressed his thumb against his knuckle. The old habit, from the years of building the plan. When the variables were still uncertain and the habit gave the mind something to do while it worked. He thought about his father, Hamilcar at the river, his boot in the moving water, the way his father had tested the current before deciding, the patience his father had when patience was required, the calculation before the crossing. His father had said, "The distance is right." He had measured the thing he was planning and found the measure correct and then crossed the river and died. His father had made one error. He had moved faster than his intelligence. He had crossed before the far bank was confirmed. The ambush had been there because he crossed before it should have been possible to cross. Hamilcar had been correct about the plan. He had been wrong about the timing. Hannibal had spent 30 years not making his father's mistake. He calculated before he moved. He waited until the calculation was complete. He had crossed the Alps after years of preparation. He had waited at each position until the position was fully understood. He had spent 23 days adjusting the formation at Cannae before he was satisfied. He did not move faster than his intelligence. He had calculated Rome. He had calculated it carefully. He had studied it the way you study something you intend to defeat. He had learned its institutions and its politics and its history and its military tradition. He had made one incorrect calculation. He had calculated Rome as a city. Rome was not a city. He did not yet know what Rome was instead. He was going to spend 13 more years trying to find out. He sat on the floor of the room that night, the old habit from the camps. He had sat this way since Spain, since the years when the floor was the only surface available. He had not needed to sit on floors for a long time. He needed it tonight, for the same reason as always. The floor was simple. The floor had no opinion about anything. He sat on the floor and pressed his thumb against his knuckle. He had come to Italy with a plan. The plan had worked. He had won every battle. He had never lost a battle in Italy. He was also not winning the war. He held this fact carefully. He did not put it down. He did not pretend it was not there. He held it and turned it in his mind and looked at it from different directions. He was not winning the war. He thought about what came next. He was good at thinking about what came next. He had always been good at this. In the worst situations, when everything was against him, when the winter was wrong and the supply lines were broken and the Italian allies were slower than planned, he had always been able to think about what came next. He thought about Mago. His brother was in Carthage now, delivering the news of Cannae, pouring the rings on the floor of the Carthaginian Senate, asking for reinforcements, asking for the ships and the soldiers and the supplies that the campaign in Italy required. He would have to wait to see what Carthage sent. He had built the plan on the assumption that Carthage would send. He was less certain of this than he had been before the campaign began. He sat on the floor. He was not done. Neither was Rome. He counted 3 things in the room: a lamp, the table, the door. He stopped at 3. He would think of what came next. He was very good at thinking about what came next. He pressed his thumb against his knuckle once more. Then he stopped. 340 miles to the north, in Rome, Fabius Maximus is in his house. He is 62 years old. He is not sleeping well. He is lying in the dark and thinking about the city, about what the city has been and what it is now, whether those are the same thing or different things, whether what happened at Cannae changed the city or revealed it. He has believed for a long time that it would survive. He has believed this through the months when no one else seemed to believe it, through the months when they were calling him cunctator and meaning it as an insult, through the months when he watched from the hills while Hannibal burned farms below. When Rome demanded he do something, he did not do something. Doing something meant fighting on Hannibal's terms. He has believed the city would survive. He was not certain until recently what the city was. He is more certain now. He lies in the dark and thinks about a city that refuses to fall, about what makes it that kind of city, about whether it has always been that kind of city, whether there was a moment when it became this, or whether this has always been inside it, waiting for the right pressure to bring it out. He does not find a clean answer. He has been looking for this answer for 40 years. He found something like an answer today, on the training grounds, watching a freedman who had learned the gladius stance in 3 days, watching officers he knew being patient with men they did not know, watching the formations improve by small increments, from not knowing to knowing, from strangers to something that was beginning to be a unit. That was the city, not the Senate, not the walls, not the consular elections or the triumphs or the old families with their records going back to the kings. The city was this, a collection of people who, when the situation required it, learned what was needed and did it, without being asked twice, without the luxury of doubt. The woman named Busa opened her grain stores. The bread sellers opened at the correct hours. The freedman learned the gladius stance. The Senate came out to the gate. These were the same thing. He understood this the way you understand something after circling it for a long time, finally coming at it from the right angle. They were the same thing, the same willingness, the same capacity, in different people at different moments doing different things, but the same underneath. He thinks about Lucius Aemilius Paulus. He thinks about the garden, the dead winter plants, the question about Cannae that he did not answer. He had walked back through the dead plants with Paulus. He had not answered because answering would have meant saying out loud what he knew was coming. He had known what was coming. He had not stopped it. He was not the consul. Paulus had been the consul. Paulus had gone anyway. He had been the careful one and he had been the staid one. He had been exactly what he was at the beginning. He had shaken his head at the horse. He had sent Lentulus away with the message. He had been on foot in the center of the formation. He had stayed. Fabius lies in the dark and thinks about this. He thinks about what kind of city produces that. He thinks about the bread sellers and the Subura and the training grounds outside the walls. He thinks about the new legions forming, the freedmen learning the interval, the officers he knows taking commands they did not expect. He thinks about the Senate coming out to the Capena gate. He thinks about the vote against ransom. He thinks about Canusium, about a young officer and a sword and tired men choosing to pick up the weapons. He has served the city his entire life. He thinks he is only now understanding what he has been serving. He is not sleeping well, but he is sleeping. Rome is still standing. That is enough for tonight. In Arpinum, 110 miles southeast of Rome, a boy is asleep. He is 4 years old. He will not remember this night. He will not remember this year. His memories will begin later, in a town where the hills are familiar, where the accent is wrong, where the grandfather's name means nothing in the forum. He was born in the wrong place. He will spend his whole life knowing this. He will also spend his whole life doing something about it. His name is Gaius Marius. This is not his story yet, but it will be. Writer's note: I do not read Rome's survival as triumph. I read it as a choice made continuously, by bread sellers and Senate votes and women in streets and one old man lying awake in the dark. The city did not survive because it was strong. It survived because it kept deciding to survive. Again, in the morning, after the news arrived, after the count came in, Hannibal made one incorrect calculation. He calculated Rome as a thing that could be beaten. Rome was not that kind of thing. It was the kind of city that thanked a losing general for surviving. The kind that armed its slaves. The kind where a woman named Busa opened her grain stores and her name went into the record. He spent 13 more years in Italy. He never found the answer to what kind of thing Rome was. Next time, Hispania. The road south smells of dust and old defeat. A young man is 24 years old. The Senate is still laughing.